We have this image of science, right? It's all about the pure, objective search for truth. You picture a pristine lab where facts are just facts, and the best ideas, they always win. But what if I told you that's not the whole story? What if the history of science is actually littered with geniuses who were ignored, ridiculed, and sometimes even punished for being right?
There's this old saying, you've probably heard it, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. Well, it turns out that applies to science too. When you challenge the establishment, when you're the one shouting for change, you become that nail. And believe me, the forces of politics, money, and just plain old human ego, they can swing a very, very heavy hammer.
So, this brings us to the big question, right? If science is supposed to be all about the facts, about evidence and data, how on earth can someone prove they're right, literally save countless lives, and still end up getting crushed by the very system they're trying to fix? The answer, as you're about to see, is, well, it's complicated. Okay, to really get this, we need to travel back in time. We're going to the 1840s to meet our first case study, a Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis. His story is wow. It's this powerful and honestly tragic example of what happens when a brilliant discovery slams right into a brick wall of human pride. So, picture this, a huge hospital in Vienna. It was built to help the city's poor. But inside the maternity wards, a nightmare is unfolding. There's this mysterious disease called childbed fever, and it's just rampant. We're talking new mothers developing these horrible fevers and dying within days. One account described them as being in frozen, speechless terror from the pain. Getting this fever was basically a death sentence. And this is where Dr. Semmelweis starts to notice something weird. The hospital had two different maternity wards. In the one run by nurses and midwives, the death rate was about 5%. Not great, but okay. But in the other ward, the one run by doctors and medical students, the death rate was a staggering 21%. He knew the common explanations, things like bad air or the alignment of the stars. That had to be nonsense. I mean, both wards had the same air, the same stars, something else, something very specific had to be going on. So he basically becomes a detective. He starts testing everything one by one. Could it be the food? He changed the food. Nope, no effect. The bed sheets? Replaced them all. Still no change. He even had this theory that maybe the priest who walked through the ward ringing a little bell was literally scaring mothers to death. So he had the priest change his route. Nothing. And then he has a breakthrough. It hits him. The doctors, unlike the nurses, started their day in the morgue, doing autopsies, and Semmelweis noticed that even after washing his hands, they still had this smell, the smell of the corpses. He called it an aura of death. And that led to his hypothesis. What if that aura, those particles from the morgue, were carrying the disease from the dead to the living? So he finds this chemical, chloride of lime, that gets rid of the smell completely. He makes it a rule. Every doctor has to disinfect their hands. And the result? It was immediate. It was staggering. The death rate in the doctor's ward went from 21% all the way down to 0. He'd done it. He'd solved the mystery. So you'd think he'd be celebrated as a hero, right? Statues, parades, the whole thing. Nope, not even close. See, Semmelweis was an outsider. He was Hungarian in an Austrian-run hospital, which was already a strike against him. But even worse, he was just terrible at playing the political game. He didn't gently suggest his idea. He basically went around telling his superiors, these respected doctors, hey, you guys are the ones killing all the new mothers. He just presented his data, thinking the truth is the truth, it'll speak for itself. But it didn't. So what was his reward for saving thousands, maybe tens of thousands of lives? He got fired. He was forced out of Vienna, basically exiled back to Hungary. He became more and more bitter and angry over the years, until he was finally committed to an insane asylum by his own peers. And he died there shortly after, a true genius, hammered down. But not every scientific pioneer ends up like that. Some succeed wildly. They just don't always do it by being saints. And that brings us to the famous Louis Pasteur, who was pretty much the exact opposite of Semmelweis in every way. I mean, where Semmelweis was this quiet, data-driven guy, Pasteur was a total showman. He got it. He understood politics, he understood presentation, he knew the power of telling a good story. He knew that to get the funding and the fame, you couldn't just be right. You had to be convincing, you had to be powerful, and yeah, sometimes you had to be ruthless. And he proved, time and again, that sometimes the best story can beat the best data. And here's where the story gets really juicy. Because for all his fame, we now know something shocking. And we know it thanks to his own private lab notes, which were unsealed 100 years later. It turns out some of his greatest public triumphs were built on lies. Remember that famous public demonstration of his anthrax vaccine? The one where he heroically saved a whole herd of sheep to thunderous applause? Yeah, it was a complete fraud. Okay, let's break this down because it's pretty wild. Pasteur went out of his way to publicly ridicule a rival, a guy named Henry Toussaint, who had developed a way to create vaccines. But then, for that big public demo, guess what? He secretly used Toussaint's exact method, all while claiming it was his own brilliant invention. And he did the same thing with a rabies vaccine, basically stealing the work from another veterinarian. He lied, he buried evidence of his failed tests, he absolutely destroyed the careers of anyone he stood in his way. He was a genius, for sure, but he played the game, and he won by any means necessary. Now, it's easy to think, okay, that's all just ancient history, but these same forces, politics, personality, ego, they're absolutely still with us. So let's fast forward to our time, to the story of Katie Carico. You might not know her name, but her work was the foundation for the COVID-19 vaccines, and her struggle shows how today, the villain isn't always some rival scientist. Sometimes, it's the whole system. For decades, I'm talking decades, Katie Carico was obsessed with this really radical idea, using something called messenger RNA, or mRNA, to make new kinds of medicine. But the scientific establishment, they thought it was a total dead end, a waste of time. She was demoted, her grant applications were rejected over and over again. At one point, she was even fired from her university post and was threatened with deportation. But she just refused to give up. And that incredible persistence, well, it eventually led to the COVID vaccines, and won her a Nobel Prize. And Carico's story really shines a light on a huge modern problem. See, in today's academic world, success is often measured by how much grant money you can bring in. And this creates a system that loves safe research, ideas that are pretty much guaranteed to get funded. It doesn't favor the risky, revolutionary, out-of-the-box ideas. There's this constant pressure to publish or perish, to just put out small, incremental findings. It chokes the creativity you need for the big breakthroughs. And it's not run by evil people. It's just a system with incentives that punish long-term vision and reward short-term, predictable results. It hammers down the nails before they even get a chance to stick up. Okay, but hold on. Before we just decide the whole system is broken, is it possible that all this resistance, this massive barrier to new ideas, actually serves a purpose? What if all that friction is actually a necessary part of the process? Well, as someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson has pointed out, this conservatism, it kind of acts like an immune system for science. For every single brilliant, groundbreaking idea like mRNA, there are probably, 999 other ideas that are just completely nuts. So skepticism is that filter. It's what protects science from falling for every crazy theory that comes along. It forces new ideas to meet a really, really high bar for evidence before they're accepted. And that brings us to the really crucial difference here, right? It's the difference between healthy skepticism and unhealthy attacks. Look, challenging ideas, demanding more evidence, questioning methods, that's not just good, that's essential science. But character assassination, threatening to deport someone, driving them into an asylum, that's not skepticism. That's just suppression. So at its core, this is a human problem, not just a science problem. We see this stuff in art, in politics, you name it. So if we know the system has these biases built in, what can we actually do to fix it? How do we build a system that makes sure the next Semmelweis or the next Carico doesn't get hammered down? Well, one really interesting idea that's been gaining some steam is something called a grant lottery. Here's how it would work. First, reviewers would do their thing and screen out any proposals that are just clearly flawed or poorly formed. But then, you're left with this pool of good, great, and even excellent proposals. Instead of trying to pick the absolute best one, which is super subjective, you'd award a chunk of the grants through a random lottery from that pool. The thinking is that this reduces all those human biases against weird ideas or younger scientists or people from less famous universities. It gives the creative, out-there ideas a real fighting chance. And this really brings us to maybe the biggest lesson of all. And it's something I think a lot of us experienced firsthand during the pandemic. We have to stop thinking of science as some kind of magic answer machine where you just plug in a question and get a perfect fact back. It's not. It's a process. And it's a messy, argumentative, and deeply human process of discovery. When we saw all the debates and the changing recommendations, That wasn't a sign that science was broken. That was a sign that it was working, right there in front of us, in real time. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us here. Science is always, always going to be a human process, with all the brilliance and all the bias that comes with that. The challenge isn't to somehow remove our humanity from it. That's impossible. The real challenge is to build a system that accounts for it, a system that champions the best ideas, not just the best politicians, and one that can lift up the quiet genius just as much as the charismatic showman.